Widowed Apache with 3 children finds a sterile woman. She became the perfect mother. The Arizona Territory of 1878 was a graveyard of dreams and a birthplace of legends. In the unforgiving embrace of the Sonoran Desert, where the sun branded flesh and hope evaporated like morning dew, survival demanded more than strength. It required the kind of resilience that could only be forged in the crucible of absolute loss. Joseph Nalnish understood this intimately. At 32, his weathered hands bore the calluses of a man who had carved life from stone, while his eyes held the haunted depth of someone who had watched death claim everything he cherished. 3 winters had passed since consumption devoured his beloved Ayana, leaving him to navigate the treacherous waters of single parenthood in a world that showed no mercy to the grieving. The morning of his monthly supply run to Tucson began like countless others, with the ritual of preparing his children for another day of his absence. His daughter Chenoa, barely 14 but carrying the weight of premature motherhood in her shoulders, moved through their adobe home with the efficient grace of someone who had learned too young that survival depended on perfect execution of daily routine. "The wind carries storms today, Papa," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of their ancestors, mixed with the practical concern of a girl who had become a woman overnight. "The sky bleeds red in the east." Joseph studied his daughter's face, seeing Ayana's delicate features overlaid with a hardness that broke his heart daily. Chenoa had inherited her mother's beauty, but also her fierce protectiveness, qualities that had been twisted by necessity into something both admirable and tragic. She plaited her long black hair with hands that should have been braiding doll's hair, not managing household accounts and mediating disputes between her younger brothers. Ahiga, 12, and caught between childhood and manhood, sat quietly sharpening arrowheads with the focused intensity their grandfather had once shown. His silence spoke volumes about the burden of being the eldest son in a family where joy had died with his mother. The boy's thin frame carried muscle earned through necessity, not play, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned that security was an illusion. 8-year-old Nakai remained the only one who still laughed freely, though even his laughter had taken on a brittle quality that suggested he understood more about their situation than anyone wanted to acknowledge. He sat cross-legged on the floor, carving animals from scraps of wood with the same patience his father displayed when working leather, his small hands already showing the precision that would make him either a skilled craftsman or a deadly warrior. "I'll bring back molasses if the trader has any," Joseph promised, knowing that such small luxuries had become the only way he could bring smiles to faces that had forgotten how to hope for anything beyond tomorrow. The journey to Tucson took him through landscape that mirrored his internal emotional terrain, vast stretches of emptiness, punctuated by moments of stark beauty that reminded him why life was worth preserving. The desert had taught him that survival required accepting both the harsh reality of loss and the unexpected gift of resilience. Each mile of sun-baked earth and wind-carved rock spoke to the fundamental truth that endurance was not about avoiding pain, but about learning to carry it with dignity. The trading post existed as a neutral territory where different worlds intersected without necessarily understanding each other. Inside, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the dreams of desperate people, Joseph moved through his purchases with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to suppress emotional response to focus on practical necessity. Flour, beans, salt, ammunition, the basic elements required to maintain life in a place where comfort was a luxury few could afford. He was examining a bolt of blue fabric, thinking of the dress Chenoa needed for the approaching winter, when her voice cut through the ambient noise of frontier commerce like a blade through silk. There was something in the timbre of her speech that spoke of drawing rooms and afternoon tea, of a world where women worried about social propriety rather than whether their children would survive the next Apache raid. "Excuse me, sir, but I couldn't help but notice your thoughtful selection of children's items. I'm an educator, and I wondered if there might be young minds in the area who would benefit from literary enrichment." Joseph turned to face the woman who had spoken, and for a moment the carefully constructed walls around his heart trembled. She was perhaps 28, with auburn hair that caught the dusty light filtering through the trading post's grimy windows. Her dress was simple, but expertly tailored, speaking of modest means but refined taste. Most striking were her green eyes, which held a depth of sadness that he recognized immediately, the look of someone who had stared into the abyss of loss and somehow found the strength to continue breathing. "I am Joseph Nalnish," he said, his English carefully modulated to avoid the stereotypical broken speech that many whites expected from his people. "I have 3 children on the reservation. They possess adequate literacy skills." The woman's face brightened with what appeared to be genuine interest, not the patronizing curiosity he had grown accustomed to from well-meaning whites who saw his children as subjects for salvation rather than individuals worthy of respect. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, recently arrived from Boston. I've accepted a position at the mission school, though I confess the frontier presents challenges I hadn't anticipated. Would you mind sharing details about your children? I'm always eager to identify potential students." Something in her manner suggested an authenticity that put Joseph at ease. Unlike the missionaries who had preceded her, she spoke to him as an equal, her gaze meeting his directly, without the mixture of fear and condescension that typically characterized such encounters. "Chenoa is 14, intellectually gifted, but burdened with premature responsibility. Ihiga is 12, fascinated by narrative and possessed of considerable artistic talent. Nakai is 8, insatiably curious about the mechanisms of the world around him." Margaret's smile transformed her entire countenance, revealing a warmth that suggested genuine caring rather than professional obligation. "They sound absolutely wonderful. I would be honored to meet them if you would consider such a visit appropriate. I have some books that might capture their interest, and I confess that I'm rather lonely here. I miss the energy and perspective that young people bring to life." The conversation continued as they completed their respective transactions, and Joseph found himself sharing more than prudence would normally dictate. There was something about Margaret's manner that invited confidence, a quality of listening that suggested she heard not just words, but the emotions underlying them. She asked thoughtful questions about his children's interests, about the challenges of raising them alone, about his hopes for their future in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to their way of life. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she said quietly, as they stood outside the trading post, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that grief was not an event, but a permanent alteration of existence. "Yellow fever claimed him in Boston. We had hoped for children, but the doctors informed me that my body was incapable of sustaining life. I suppose that explains why I've thrown myself so completely into teaching. Other people's children have become my emotional investment." Joseph felt the recognition that passes between souls who have been hollowed out by loss and somehow found the courage to continue living. "I offer my condolences for your loss," he said simply, understanding that elaborate sympathy often felt like an insult to those who had experienced true devastation. "And I for yours," she replied, her eyes reflecting the kind of understanding that cannot be feigned. "Your children are extraordinarily fortunate to have a father who demonstrates such profound concern for their welfare and development." As Joseph prepared to mount his horse for the return journey, Margaret made a decision that would alter the trajectory of all their lives. "Mr. Nalnish, I realize this might be presumptuous, but would you permit me to visit your children? I have some books I'd genuinely love to share with them, and I must admit that I'm quite isolated here. I miss the stimulation of young minds and the energy of family life." Joseph hesitated, acutely aware that the reservation was no place for a refined Eastern woman who had probably never experienced genuine hardship. Yet something in her manner reminded him of Ayana's generous spirit, a quality of openness that had made his late wife beloved by everyone who knew her. "You would be welcome in our home," he said finally. "However, I must warn you that the journey is arduous and the living conditions primitive by your standards. I've been riding since childhood. Margaret said with a smile that suggested steel beneath the silk, "and I suspect I'm considerably more resilient than my appearance might suggest." The following morning brought Margaret to the reservation, riding a sturdy mare and carrying a leather satchel filled with books and small gifts. Joseph watched from his doorway as she approached, noting how she sat her horse with confidence and how her eyes took in the landscape with appreciation rather than judgment. She had dressed practically, a simple riding habit that suggested she understood the demands of frontier life, yet she maintained an air of dignity that spoke to her essential character. Chenoa emerged from the house, her natural curiosity overcoming the wariness that had become second nature since her mother's death. "Papa, who is the woman approaching our home?" "This is Miss Sullivan, daughter. She is an educator who has expressed interest in meeting you and your brothers." Margaret dismounted with practiced grace and approached the girl with a warmth that seemed to dissolve the invisible barriers that typically separated Apache children from white adults. "You must be Chenoa. Your father spoke of you with such pride. I brought some books I thought might interest you, and I'm hoping you might teach me about life here. I have so much to learn." Within moments, Margaret had drawn all three children into conversation with a skill that spoke to genuine affection for young people rather than professional obligation. She listened to Chenoa's careful recitation of an English poem with the attention of someone who understood the courage required to perform in a second language. She examined Ahiga's collection of interesting stones with the fascination of a natural scientist, asking questions that revealed the geological significance of his findings. She patiently answered Nakai's endless questions about Boston and the ocean and the mechanics of book production with the patience of someone who understood that curiosity was the foundation of all learning. Joseph observed from a distance, amazed by the naturalness of her interactions with his children. There was no condescension in her manner, no attempt to impose foreign values or suggest that they needed to become something other than what they were. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding their world, asking about their traditions, their language, their dreams for the future. "Papa," Chenoa said later after Margaret had departed with promises to return the following week, "she doesn't look at us as if we're specimens in a museum. She sees us as people. She asked me to teach her Apache words," added Ahiga, his chest swelling with pride. "She said she wanted to understand our way of thinking about the world." Even young Nakai had been charmed by the encounter. "She smells like spring flowers, Papa, and she promised to bring me a book about horses that includes pictures of all the different breeds." Joseph found himself anticipating Margaret's visits with an intensity that surprised him. She arrived every week without fail, always carrying books or small gifts for the children, always staying for the simple meals that Chenoa prepared with increasing skill and confidence. Margaret praised the girls' cooking with genuine enthusiasm, helped with lessons in a way that enhanced rather than replaced traditional Apache education, and gradually became an integral part of their weekly routine. As autumn transformed the desert into a palette of gold and crimson, Joseph began to notice subtle changes in his household dynamics. Margaret's influence was gentle but profound, like water gradually reshaping stone. She had taught Chenoa new methods of food preparation that enhanced both nutrition and flavor, had brought seeds for a garden that was thriving despite the harsh conditions through careful attention to soil preparation and water conservation. She had encouraged Ahiga's artistic talents by providing proper materials and techniques, allowing him to create drawings that captured the stark beauty of their landscape with remarkable sophistication. For Nakai, she had become a patient teacher who made learning feel like adventure rather than obligation. But it was the transformation in Margaret herself that most fascinated Joseph. The pale, somewhat fragile woman who had first approached him in the trading post had been gradually replaced by someone who radiated health and confidence. The desert sun had given her skin a warm glow. Her movements had become more decisive, and her eyes held a contentment that spoke of someone who had discovered their true purpose in life. "I never imagined I could find such profound satisfaction here," she confided to Joseph one evening as they sat outside his home, watching the sun set over the red rocks while the children worked on their lessons inside. "In Boston, I felt like I was constantly performing a role that never quite fit properly. Here, with your children, I feel like I'm finally living authentically." Joseph studied her profile in the golden light, seeing not the refined Eastern lady who had first captured his attention, but a woman who had found strength in adversity and purpose in service. "The desert has a way of revealing who we truly are beneath all the layers of social expectation," he replied thoughtfully. "It strips away everything that is not essential to survival." Margaret nodded, her understanding reflecting the deeper wisdom she had gained through months of frontier life. "I spent years in Boston feeling incomplete because I couldn't bear children. The doctors spoke of me as if I was somehow fundamentally flawed, broken in a way that could never be repaired. Here, with Chenoa and Ahiga and Nakai, I feel whole for the first time in my adult life." Joseph felt his heart constrict with recognition of the pain underlying her words. "My children have grown to love you, Margaret. They anticipate your visits with the excitement they once reserved for feast days. And I love them with an intensity that surprises me," she said simply. "They've healed wounds in my soul that I didn't even realize were still bleeding." As winter settled over the territory with its harsh beauty and daily survival challenges, Margaret's visits became more frequent and extended. She had taken indefinite leave from the mission school, claiming she needed time to develop innovative teaching methodologies. In reality, she could no longer bear to be separated from the family that had become the center of her emotional universe. The children had begun calling her Mama Margaret spontaneously, without any encouragement from Joseph, and she had embraced the title with a joy that was evident to anyone who observed her with them. She had mastered the preparation of traditional Apache foods, had learned the intricate art of clothing repair and maintenance, and had developed an intuitive understanding of childhood psychology that allowed her to address problems before they became crises. More importantly, she had learned to love without reservation or expectation of reciprocation, to give of herself completely while asking for nothing in return except the privilege of being part of their lives. This quality of selfless devotion had transformed not just her own existence, but the entire emotional climate of Joseph's household. It was during a particularly cold January evening, as they sat around the fire in Joseph's modest home, that the underlying truth of their situation finally demanded acknowledgement. Margaret was helping Nakai with his reading, while Chenoa and Ahiga worked on mathematical problems, and Joseph found himself overwhelmed by the completeness of the domestic scene before him. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of months of accumulated emotion, "I need to discuss something of vital importance with you." She looked up from the book she was sharing with Nakai, her eyes meeting his with the absolute trust that had developed between them over months of shared responsibility and mutual respect. "Of course, Joseph. Children, please prepare yourselves for bed. Miss Sullivan and I need to speak privately." When they were alone, Joseph struggled to find adequate words for the transformation that had occurred in his heart. "These past months, observing your interaction with my children, witnessing how you've restored joy to our home, I had forgotten what it felt like to be part of a complete family unit." Margaret's breathing became shallow as she recognized the direction of his words. "Joseph, please allow me to finish," he said, his voice thick with barely controlled emotion. "I understand that I am merely a widowed Apache man with 3 children and limited material resources. I recognize that your people and mine have often been in conflict, that a union between us would face considerable social opposition. But I also know that you have brought light into our darkness, that you have loved my children as if they had been born of your own body, and that I have developed feelings for you that go far beyond gratitude or friendship." Tears began streaming down Margaret's face, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Joseph, I love you too. I love you and Chenoa and Ahiga and Nakai with an intensity that frightens me sometimes. I never expected to find such profound happiness anywhere, much less in a place I initially saw as exile. Then will you consent to marry me? He asked, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Will you agree to become not just Mama Margaret, but truly their mother in every legal and spiritual sense, and my wife in all the ways that matter? Margaret's response came not in words, but in the way she reached for his hands, grasping them as if they were lifelines in a storm. Yes, Joseph, yes, with every fiber of my being. Dree. The wedding ceremony took place in late spring, a carefully orchestrated event that blended Apache traditions with Christian customs in a way that honored both their backgrounds. The reservation community, initially skeptical of the white woman who had captured their widowed friend's heart, had gradually come to accept and admire Margaret's genuine commitment to Apache ways and her fierce devotion to Joseph's children. Margaret wore a dress of deep blue cotton that she had sewn herself, decorated with intricate beadwork that Chenoa had created over many evenings of patient labor. The design incorporated traditional Apache symbols of fertility and protection, transformed through the girl's artistic vision into something that was both beautiful and spiritually significant. Joseph wore ceremonial Apache clothing that Margaret had helped him prepare, understanding that this day represented not just their personal union, but the symbolic joining of two distinct worlds. The ceremony was conducted jointly by the reservation's medicine man and a sympathetic Christian minister, creating a ritual that acknowledged both spiritual traditions while emphasizing the universal nature of love and commitment. As they exchanged vows, Margaret spoke in both English and the Apache phrases she had painstakingly learned, her voice strong despite the tears that streamed down her face. I promise to be the mother that Chenoa, Ahiga, and Nakai deserve, she said, her words carrying the weight of absolute commitment. I promise to honor the memory of Ayana while creating new memories with all of you. I promise to love this family with every breath in my body, to protect them with every ounce of strength I possess, and to ensure that their Apache heritage is preserved and celebrated. Joseph's vows were equally profound in their simplicity and depth. I promise to love you, not just as my wife, but as the woman who restored my children's capacity for joy, who demonstrated that love could exist again in our home. I promise to protect you and cherish you, and to never forget that you chose us when you could have chosen safety and comfort elsewhere. The children participated actively in the ceremony, understanding that this was not merely about their father finding companionship, but about their family achieving a completeness that had seemed impossible after their mother's death. Chenoa held wildflowers that Margaret had taught her to identify and harvest, while Ahiga and Nakai stood solemnly beside their father, their small hands clutching ceremonial items that symbolized their acceptance of Margaret as their new mother. As the ceremony concluded, and the modest gathering celebrated with food and music, Margaret found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The Boston physicians had declared her barren, using clinical terminology that made her feel like a defective machine rather than a woman with unlimited capacity for love. They had focused exclusively on her body's inability to conceive, never considering the possibility that her true calling might involve nurturing children who had already been born. In the months following their wedding, Margaret threw herself into her expanded role with the same passionate intensity she had once brought to formal education. She transformed their simple home into a place of learning and growth, where traditional Apache knowledge was seamlessly integrated with practical skills needed for survival in a changing world. She established a garden that provided both sustenance and beauty, learning to preserve foods for winter consumption while maintaining the delicate balance between innovation and tradition. More than the practical improvements, Margaret brought an intangible quality to their family life that had been missing since Ayana's death. She restored the sound of laughter to their home, filling it with the voices of children who felt secure enough to express joy freely. She created celebrations around small achievements and ordinary moments, teaching her adopted children that life was worth savoring even in the midst of hardship. Most importantly, she provided the emotional stability that allowed each child to develop their individual potential. For Chenoa, she became a mentor who helped the girl transition from premature motherhood back to adolescence, while still honoring the maturity that circumstances had forced upon her. For Ahiga, she became an artistic collaborator who encouraged his creative talents, while helping him understand that sensitivity was a strength rather than a weakness. For Nakai, she became the patient teacher who could answer his endless questions while nurturing his natural curiosity about the world. As their first year as a complete family drew to a close, Joseph often found himself marveling at Margaret's transformation. She had adapted to reservation life with a grace that surprised even him, finding joy in simple pleasures and developing resilience in the face of challenges that would have defeated less determined individuals. She had become not just a mother to his children, but a respected member of their community, sharing her knowledge while learning from the wisdom of Apache elders. "Do you ever experience regret about leaving Boston?" he asked her one evening as they sat together on their porch, watching the children play in the yard with the uninhibited enthusiasm of young people who felt completely secure in their parents' love. Margaret considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness before responding. "I miss certain aspects of city life," she said honestly. "The libraries, the theaters, the easy access to books and music. But I don't miss the person I was there. I don't miss feeling like I was constantly being evaluated and found inadequate." She paused, her eyes following Nakai as he attempted to catch a butterfly with the focused determination that characterized all his endeavors. "Here, with you and the children, I'm precisely who I was meant to be. I'm a mother, a wife, a teacher, a valued member of a community. I'm complete in ways I never imagined possible." Joseph reached for her hand, noting how it had changed over the months, no longer soft and pale, but strong and capable, marked by the honest labor of caring for a family and creating beauty in harsh circumstances. "You have given us infinitely more than we ever dared hope for," he said softly. "And you have given me everything I believed I could never possess," she replied. "The Boston physicians were wrong about so many things, Joseph. I may not have been able to conceive children, but I was absolutely meant to be a mother, simply not in the conventional manner that society expects." As night settled over the desert, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and gold, Margaret called the children inside for their evening routine. They came running immediately, their faces radiant with the security of knowing that both parents would be present to participate in bedtime rituals, to listen to their concerns and dreams, and to provide the unconditional love that every child needs to thrive. "Mama Margaret," Nakai said as she helped him change into his sleeping clothes, "were you always destined to be our mother, even before you came to live with us?" Margaret's heart expanded with overwhelming love for this boy who had accepted her so completely and without reservation. "I believe I was, sweetheart. I think perhaps I was always meant to be your mother, but it simply took time for fate to guide me to where you were waiting." "I'm grateful you found us," Chenoa said from her bed, her voice soft with approaching sleep. "I'm grateful Papa found you too." "So am I, my darling," Margaret whispered, kissing each child's forehead with the tenderness of someone who understood that these moments were precious beyond measure. "So am I." As she and Joseph prepared for sleep that night, Margaret reflected on the mysterious workings of destiny that had brought them together. She had arrived in Arizona territory as a woman convinced that her inability to bear children rendered her fundamentally incomplete. Instead, she had discovered a family that needed her as desperately as she needed them, and a love that had transformed wounds into wisdom. The Boston physicians had been tragically wrong in their assessment. They had focused exclusively on what her body couldn't accomplish, never considering what her heart was capable of achieving. They had perceived sterility as limitation, never understanding that it might represent preparation for a different kind of maternal calling. They had measured her worth through biological function, never recognizing that her true gift lay in her unlimited capacity for selfless love. Margaret had indeed become the perfect mother, not despite her inability to bear children, but because of the unique perspective that experience had given her. Freed from the biological imperative that drove some women to motherhood, she had been able to choose her maternal role purely from love. She had selected these specific children, this particular family, this challenging but rewarding life, with complete understanding of what it would require and total commitment to giving everything she possessed. As she lay in her husband's arms, listening to the peaceful breathing of their children in the adjacent room, Margaret Sullivan Nalnish understood that she had found her true home. Not merely in the geographical sense, though she had grown to love the austere beauty of the desert landscape, but in the profound sense of belonging that comes from being exactly where divine providence intended you to be. The territory surrounding them continued to evolve, becoming more settled as years passed, and the old ways gradually gave ground to new realities. The future held uncertainties that none of them could predict or control. But Margaret faced that unknown future with confidence, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would confront them as a unified family. She had 3 children who called her mama with absolute sincerity, a husband who loved her with the depth that comes from shared adversity, and a community that had accepted her as one of their own. In the profound quiet of the desert night, Margaret offered prayers of gratitude for the circuitous path that had led her to this moment of perfect contentment. She had set out to educate other people's children, and had instead found her own family waiting in the most unexpected place. She had believed herself barren, and had discovered that she was actually extraordinarily fertile in ways that transcended biology. She had assumed her life was effectively over, and had instead found that her true existence was just beginning. The story of Margaret Sullivan and Joseph Nalnish would echo through generations in the territory, preserved as evidence that love could transcend any barrier, that families could be formed through conscious choice as well as biological accident, and that sometimes the most precious gifts arrived disguised as the most devastating losses. It was a narrative of healing and hope, of 2 profoundly wounded people who had found wholeness in each other, and in the children who had unknowingly served as the catalysts for their transformation. But beyond the romantic elements, it was fundamentally a story about the transcendent power of love in all its forms. Not just the passion between man and woman, but the deeper love that binds parent to child, the love that chooses to see potential where others perceive only limitation, the love that constructs bridges across cultural divides and creates families from the most unlikely combinations of human hearts. Margaret had arrived in Arizona territory as a woman who had been medically declared incapable of motherhood. She had discovered instead that she was destined to become the most perfect mother imaginable, the kind who selected her children through spiritual recognition rather than biological production, who loved them with the fierce devotion of someone who understood that family was about emotional commitment rather than genetic connection, and who demonstrated that sometimes the most important contributions we make to the world are not the ones we initially believe we're supposed to offer. The physicians in Boston had been wrong about everything that truly mattered. Margaret Sullivan was not sterile in any meaningful sense. She had simply been waiting for the right souls to nurture. And when she finally found Joseph's children, she didn't merely become their mother. She became the mother they needed, the mother they deserved, the mother she had always been destined to become. And in doing so, she proved that love was indeed the most powerful force in the universe, capable of healing any wound and creating miracles from the ashes of despair.